Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Assess and Inform Your Community Foundation's Efforts of Community Leadership. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you with us for the first time, we are thrilled to have you. My name is David Rosado, and I'm the Director of CF Insights at Candid, based in New York City. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Elizabeth Zabada, who will be supporting this webinar behind the scenes and monitoring the questions you submit via chat. For a combined 90 years, Foundation Center and GuideStar each helped change the world by giving people the information they needed to do good. In February 2019, the two organizations joined forces to become Candid. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that everyone should have the facts. The greatest service we can provide is to be upfront about all that we know. We envision a social sector capable of tackling critical challenges and opportunities of our time. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. I am pleased to introduce my co-panelists for today, Deborah Elwood, President and CEO of CFLeads, Sarah Grunwald, VP for Community Impact at the Delaware Community Foundation, and Simeon Bannister, VP of Community Programs at the Rochester Area Community Foundation in New York. And we're going to hear from all of our panelists in a few minutes, but I thought I'd set the table for everyone, starting by saying a little bit about CF Insights. CF Insights, a service of Candid, asks a simple but important question, and that is, what if each community foundation could know what all community foundations collectively know? Through CF Insights, we provide a benchmarking platform for community foundations to inform their own decision-making by leveraging metrics such as growth in assets, fundraising, and grant making, staff breakdowns by function, administrative fees, operating expenses, and so much more. We also perform research on trends in the field and provide consulting services for community foundations looking to better understand how resources are being allocated, test the impact of different market scenarios on their economic model, and much more. But today, we're going to be talking about a brand new resource that we developed to help community foundations measure their engagement in their community leadership work. And we're going to start with how we got to this point. Thanks to the generous support of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, we were able to embark on a deliberate development process that included a review of community leadership-related materials, including internal documents that state the Foundation's theory of change, and other materials sent to us by field leaders. We hosted two pilots, one which was closed with 6 initial testers, all of whom we also interviewed, and one open pilot with a little more than 30 testers who provided feedback. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about community leadership? You can refer to it briefly as the proactive work of a community foundation to create impact beyond the use of their grant making, but there's more to it than that. CFLeads promotes the idea that the community foundation is a partner that works toward a better future for all and understands the importance of bringing other people and groups into that process. Other definitions state that community leadership involves taking on more complex, demanding, active roles to connect stakeholders, while helping to drive decision-making and state the importance of finding, creating, and embracing opportunities to use the full range of the foundation's financial assets, but also staff, expertise, connections, and other tools and ways to work toward broadly shared prosperity. And you could say that the through line between these different definitions is that there's a willingness by the community foundation to not only maximize their own resources beyond grant making dollars, but also a willingness to recognize the valuable assets, which is to say the experiences and the expertise of the community members that you work with and partners that you work with in other sectors that already exist in the community. And as you can see, community foundations see themselves as embodying many different roles, including capacity builder, even-handed convener, coalition builder, advocate, and many more. And if you're familiar with CF Insights, you're familiar with our annual Columbus survey of community foundations, which is typically focused on financial metrics, but we do have a few questions about community leadership activities and ask whether or not the community foundation engages in one of the 6 activities that are on this slide, like convening of local leaders, research on community needs. And as you could see, close to all of our respondents take on at least one of them. And several of our respondents take on more than one of them. There's a lot of overlap here as well. And each of these activities is undertaken by a majority of respondents, more than half, except in the case of influencing public policy. And even there, it's basically half, it's close to half. But it's not enough to ask whether or not community foundations engage in these and other activities at all, but it's important to also understand the extent to which they undergo this work by measuring it and tracking it, and help inform what steps need to be taken to deepen that engagement. And to do that, we developed a new tool that was influenced by two already existing resources. The first is CFLeads Framework for Community Leadership, which identifies first, second, and third level building blocks for community leadership, and captures recurring themes related to this type of work, including connections, credibility, and capacity. And I want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues at CFLeads, and you'll hear from Deborah a little later, for providing such valuable guidance throughout the development of the tool we're discussing today. The other resource is the Ford Foundation's organizational mapping tool. And that was created to help the staff of any organization, mission-driven organization, reflect on strengths and identify areas where further refinement might be helpful. This tool was designed to lead staff through a detailed exercise to build organization-wide consensus on areas for improvement. And the results of all of this work culminated in the recent launch of our community leadership assessment tool, which focuses on foundations' engagement and community leadership activities, including their level of commitment to many of its dimensions. And it's designed as a self-assessment of the foundation's performance of these activities. The assessment tool examines 4 broad areas of community leadership, including organizational culture, relationships, resources, and understanding and skills. And under each of those different high-level categories, high-level areas, are several specific dimensions such as this one. And the tool has over 40 different dimensions in total. And this is under organizational culture, and this is long-term focus. And we're not going to really spend time on this particular item because we're going to unpack some other specific items a little bit later. But this is to give you an idea of what the layout of the assessment tool looks like. And all of these items are on a 7-point scale, and this is looking at long-term focus, as I mentioned. So this asks whether the community foundation applies a short-term lens in its work to address what could be the symptom of a longer-term issue, or whether the foundation seeks to address the root causes of issues facing the community and seeks to create long-term impact by developing and following a clearly defined strategy. And I mentioned this, but all of these items are on a 7-point scale with descriptions to help you better understand how you can define minimal, basic, moderate, or strong engagement in these different activities. Now, at the foundation level, this tool was designed to inform practice by creating a consensus internally on whether there are areas for improvement and what those areas of improvement are. You can access the print version of the Community Leadership Assessment Tool at the links on the slide, and the tool itself is also one of the handouts available to you in the webinar platform, so you can just grab it from there. And we also developed an online version of the tool. And submitted results from the tool that are submitted online will be aggregated to provide a broader perspective on how foundations are engaging in community leadership efforts. We've set up a way to share your results via this online version, and you can get to it by going to candid.org/howwelead. The content in both versions is all exactly the same, so my recommendation is to reference the print version of the tool, familiarize yourself with all of its different dimensions, work with your teams internally to complete the assessment, and then leverage it as a driver of internal conversation, and also share your responses with us online so we could say a little bit more about what's happening out in the field. So with that, I want to bring on the first of our panelists, and I'm going to start with Deborah Elwood. And for a brief introduction, since joining CFLeads in 2009, Deborah has worked to build alliances that help community foundations deepen their impact. Deborah has a broad background as an advocate, policy analyst, grant maker, fundraiser, and community builder. She served as both a board and staff leader during 10 years with the Rochester Area Community Foundation, setting strategies that led to greater partnerships, more focused grant making, and deeper community impact. Deborah, thank you again for joining us.
Hi, David. It's really wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you on the webinar today. And I'm really happy to participate with Simeon and Sarah also, who of course are two terrific VP leaders. You know, we are so excited, David, to see the community leadership metrics come to fruition. Because as you've noted before, many community foundations have been looking for some other way to measure themselves and measure their work beyond grants and assets. So we're really grateful to you for your thoughtfulness and intentionality and the experience that Candid brings to this process. And it was a real pleasure working with you along the way. And we're also really glad that you were able to build on the framework for community leadership, which has really served as a foundational document for the field that hundreds of community foundations have worked with. We've always seen it as a living document, and so, we're really glad that it continues to be a vital resource. So thank you, David, really grateful. So I think many of you know that CFLeads is a national network of community foundations working together to build strong communities. And recently, through a series of webinars over the past month, we released some groundbreaking research that set out to document the environment in which community foundations are operating and get a fresh perspective on where the field is headed. Now, this was based on a year's worth of work. We enlisted an advisory committee of 15 CEOs from community foundations that serve large urban areas and small regions, suburban regions, and small rural communities. So we really had community foundations that really covered all different kinds of populations in the United States. That advisory committee met 6 times, several times in 2019 and several times in 2020 after COVID and the sand started shifting beneath all of us. Then we also commissioned Candid to field a survey to really learn more. And this went quite a bit deeper than the Columbus survey to really understand what community foundations were learning about their own communities and where they wanted to do more. That was completed by 150 community foundations, and according to Candid, the responses were very representative of the field in terms of size and location. So then, in addition to the advisory committee and the survey, then we conducted dozens of interviews with CEOs. It's a very iterative process, again, begun last year, but really able to capture the rapidly changing environment in 2020 due to COVID, the national reckoning on race, and even the political environment. So it was very, as I said, very iterative throughout the conversations. The main finding from the research was that an eye-popping 98% of community foundation leaders plan to deepen or expand their community leadership activity over the next few years. Essentially, community foundations are going all in on community leadership. And this was from community foundations, again, of all sizes, from all parts of the country, who are really eager to take on and deepen their roles beyond grant making. And so to ensure that they're going to be more effective partners in really building those equitable, inclusive, and widely prosperous communities that we're all really striving for. So the research identified 3 interconnected areas of momentum. And the first is that we are seeing community foundations insisting on racial equity. We are seeing a commitment by many community foundations to do their part to remedy the injustices and inequities that are creating pretty serious barriers to prosperity for people of color. And I think one of the really interesting things about our finding is that there was a recognition that this needs to be a true institutional commitment. Community foundations as institutions are stepping up in this area. Specifically, our research found that they are reorienting their missions and their values and their strategies all around racial equity, and some really seeing it as their North Star. And then they're also operationalizing equity internally at the same time that they strive to reduce racial inequities in the community and are really serving in a leadership capacity in that way. The second area of momentum identified by our research is amplifying community voice. Community foundations really see a role for themselves in ensuring an engaged and informed citizenry, which of course is absolutely vital to a healthy democracy. So what they're doing is they're convening community conversations on a variety of topics. Now, this is something, of course, it's been core to community foundations for a long time, but they intend to keep doing that and doing more of it. They're also elevating resident voice and power, and really interested in elevating resident voice and power so that people who have traditionally been excluded from local decision making can inform and lead local action in the future. They're also investing in local journalism, which, as we know, is a critical element of a well-functioning democracy. And then we're seeing community foundations fueling participation in democracy by supporting critical democratic systems and processes such as census participation or voter registration. And then the third and final area of momentum we uncovered through our work is influencing public policy and systems. Because government policies and programs affect almost every aspect of our lives and pretty significantly, community foundations are seeing that they'll have the greatest impact by helping to shape those policies and other big systems like employer practices. Community foundations thus are commissioning and sharing local research because good policy depends on good data. And again, this has been a real role of many community foundations for a long time. And then they're also mobilizing stakeholders across sectors, really recognizing that they can't make the kind of change that's needed as one institution or even one sector. And then finally, community foundations are advocating for specific public policy changes using their own institutional influence and their own reputational capital, using their own voice. So if you want to learn more about all this, it's all captured on our web portal at CFLeads/goingallin. And the portal includes background on why these areas of practice matter. It gives dozens and dozens of examples of this momentum and provides resources and organizations for you to consult as you go along the way. But what we'd like to do today is to show you how the community leadership metrics can support you as you might be leaning into these particular areas. And we also want to show you how the areas of momentum tie to the framework for community leadership that David referenced and how that ties to the metrics. So David and I are going to just walk through this a little bit to show you how this might work.
Great, and thank you so much, Deborah, and congratulations again, of course, on the launch of Going All In.
Thanks.
And as you just alluded to, speaking of Going All In and these three areas of momentum, Deborah, her colleague Lynn Bartel, and I have had several conversations about how the specific areas examined through the community leadership assessment tool align well with the framework and align with these different areas of momentum. And we're going to talk through each of the three areas and how these all complement each other. So, and we're going to go through in the future as well, we're going to go through the rest of the community leadership tool and the framework to see what other areas of alignment might, we might be able to lift up, and we'll make those public when we get through that full crosswalk exercise. So our thought is that the community foundations will be able to leverage the framework's building blocks, right, to understand what specific steps they need to take to deepen engagement in these different areas. And the assessment tool is a way to help you chart a course and track your progress on that journey toward the strong indicator, if you want to ground it in the layout of the actual tool itself. So to that end, let's go ahead and start with insisting on racial equity. Could you say where that building block in the framework that aligns well with that area of momentum?
Absolutely. So as David said, we looked through the framework for community leadership, which a number of you are, of course, familiar with, and is in part of the handouts that were accompanied this webinar. And just tried to look through which of the building blocks were really directly in line with this notion of insisting on equity. And one that seemed absolutely fitting was what we call building block A3, which is the community foundation is fundamentally committed and organized to increase opportunity, diverse participation, and fairness. And so there are a number of metrics, David, that might fit with this, but you've identified one here that is a really nice fit that could help them measure their progress.
Yeah, and the assessment tool has a handful of items that are dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of them actually map very well onto this building block. But
Yes.
yeah, let's focus on the role of power here, and that looks at whether the foundation recognizes historical power imbalances, right, and the role of race and class in its work in the community at all. Whether the foundation defines a clear strategy to address those factors, speaks about power imbalances clearly and explicitly, while accounting for those factors both internally and also very importantly externally. And Deborah, I think that's the key right there, right? It's that that willingness to be able not just to understand the power imbalance, but also to feel empowered to acknowledge their existence in basically all venues, internal, external. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that before we move to the next item.
No, I just think, talking about, a number of tools to address these things. It's not just one thing that you bring to the table. It's a number of things that you bring to the table. And I think that's kind of a theme throughout the metrics, is how much are you bringing to the table? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, moving from there, if we look at amplifying community voice, the second of the three areas of momentum from the study, from the Going All In study, could you speak to where in the framework you see that being highlighted?
Sure. So we found this best exhibited in building block B2. The Community Foundation is positioned to join with or convene those involved in, affected by, or concerned by an issue. I think one thing that's kind of important to mention on this particular area is there's a lot of growth in all of these areas, but there's a lot of growth in these, and we're all on a journey together, trying to figure out how to do all this work better. And again, that's why the metrics can be so helpful, because they can really get very specific about what it means to do this work well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in the assessment tool, there's a section on shared leadership, which includes consultation with policymakers and the private sector. But for now, we're going to focus on consultation with community members. And those are the community members for whom the decisions the Community Foundation makes are arguably the most impactful. I mentioned this idea earlier of the foundation as a community partner. And here that focus is on the partnership with members of the community who are among those affected by and concerned about an issue. It questions how community leadership priorities are determined. In some cases, there could be some consultation with community members, and it could be that the priorities are still ultimately determined by foundation staff or even its donors. But this can also help you examine whether a systematic approach to gathering the input of community stakeholders and learning from research on community needs as well as a complementary source of information can help drive informed decision-making around leadership priorities, which could be really, really crucial to create buy-in from your staff and donors as well.
Great.
And so, Deborah, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, and then we can move on to our last item.
No,
here.
I think that was great. Thanks.
Sure, and I'm going to pause right here really quickly and say, for anyone in the audience, feel free to share your questions in the chat. There are a couple of really interesting questions that came in already, and we should have ample time to address those. So thanks to those of you who have submitted questions so far. So the last area of momentum from Going All In is public policy, influencing public policy and systems. Deborah, do you want to say a little bit about that and where you find it in the framework?
Sure. As I noted in the sort of brief recap of this work, one of the critical pieces of influencing public policy is to bring good data and research to the table. Now, of course, all of these things overlap. All three of these areas of momentum overlap, and of course, you don't just bring good data and research to the table for public policy work. But that's what you and I, David, thought might be interesting to drill down on a little bit. So the second level building block in the framework for community leadership that seemed to fit nicely with this was D1, where the Community Foundation actively learns about, with, and for the community. And so we thought this metric about community knowledge seemed to be a good fit with that.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. And to build a little bit on what you just said as well, yeah, these are items that that relate to these different areas of momentum, but there are several others in both the framework and the leadership assessment tool that can also fit under these different areas of momentum and help inform the Community Foundation's efforts to deepen engagement in any one of those areas as well. But of course, for the purposes of time, we're focusing on the specific ones we're highlighting for now. And when we speak with Sarah and Simeon, we'll get to dig into a handful of other areas as well. But for now, I want to highlight the area of research, and that's under the community knowledge section of the tool. And what's notable here is that the scale at right from the assessment tool is essentially, the way I think of it, is kind of a zoomed in version of the building block on the left, because the basic rating reflects an active effort by the foundation to learn about the community. The moderate rating reflects an effort to learn with the community, right? That is not just gathering the information necessary, but also sharing it back with the community. And the strong rating reflects learning about, with, and for the community by not only going out of its way to find objective information, but also working to generate or support the generation anyway of the information if it doesn't exist. What is that relevant information? The foundation helps support the generation of that. And crucially, make sure it to share it with the community in every case to keep themselves accountable as well, if everybody's working from the same base of knowledge. And Deborah, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that before we move on to Sarah and Simeon.
Well, I think, again, it just emphasizes the overlap, as you just noted, between community voice, because that's a piece of research. That's a piece of data. Research doesn't just have to be numerical.
Absolutely.
So I think it just really shows the interconnectedness of all of this. Nope, looks great.
Let's go ahead and hear from our Community Foundation leaders.
Great.
Sarah, and I'll introduce you both, Sarah and Simeon. So first, Sarah Grunwald leads the Delaware Community Foundation's community engagement work, including overseeing grant making and scholarship programs, facilitating public-private partnerships throughout the state, and driving the foundation's leadership activities to strengthen the foundation's community impact and service to donors. She most recently served as Deputy Executive Director of the Policy Innovators in Education Network, supporting a national network of state-level education advocacy organizations to maximize their impact. And Simeon Bannister manages the Rochester Area Community Foundation's Community Programs Department, which is responsible for the foundation's grant-making and community leadership. He is a former member of the Rush Henrietta Board of Education and currently serves as president of the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission, and also serves on the boards of the Congressional Award Foundation, the Hillside Children's Foundation, the Children's Agenda, and the Genesee Lion Trust. Sarah, Simeon, thank you both so much for joining us today. And I want to mention right at the top that you were both two of our earliest testers of the tool way back during the first closed pilot that I spoke about at the beginning of the program. So I, again, want to thank you very much for your valuable feedback during the crucial early stages of the tool's development. But I'm going to start with a very simple question for each of you, and I'm going to start with you, Simeon. You wrote an insightful blog post for us recently that speaks to this, and I think we'll share a link to that in the chat for anybody who wants to read that. But I want to ask here in this venue, what did you think when you first tested the tool? Are there any first impressions that you want to share? And how did you envision leveraging it internally with your team?
Sure. So number one, David, thank you for inviting me to this this conversation, and so glad to be here with Candid, and also my good friends over at CFLeads. Deborah, as you, in case you missed it, for those that are listening, held the job that I have now, a few folks before me. So really grateful for her leadership and for the work that CFLeads did in 2008 and again in 2013 to provide a framework for community leadership that, as we've heard, has really been the basis for so much of the work that's come out in the community leadership assessment tool. When I first saw it, the timing was quite interesting because I had recently taken on the role that I was in, and I was searching for a way to kind of quantify this thing that we call community leadership. And every time I kept reaching for ways to quantify it, to measure it, it was very resistant to that. And the reason I would argue is because in many ways, community leadership is measurement resistant, that trying to reduce it down to just a couple of data points kind of misses the texture and the quality of community leadership. And so when I was asked to kind of chime in with a blog contribution, I referenced the very interesting work of Jerry Muller, has a book called The Tyranny of Metrics. And in that piece, he says, not everything that is important is measurable, and much that is measurable is unimportant. And said, community leadership has a lot of facets that are very critical for us to be engaged. But again, they are things that are very measurement resistant. And this time in particular calls for us to really lean in. COVID-19 is certainly placing all kinds of demands on all of us, both in terms of the disease as well as the economic impacts. Unfortunately, in my town, we were identified in a New York Times article as the #1 community that's most vulnerable potentially to the effects of COVID-19. And so there's a lot of work for us to lean in and do the work of community leadership. And we needed a way to know that we were being successful, to know that we were making progress, to know that we were making headway without, again, reducing it down to a state set of measurements. In Jerry's book, he offers us a rubric-based approach. And that rubric-based approach is evidenced in the community leadership assessment tool. That it isn't just kind of, the scale, but in addition to the scale, there's a description. And each of those descriptions help to kind of paint some guideposts for how we can proceed to define the work that we're doing. And so we've had, some really interesting, engagement with the tool. And I would say three things really kind of jump out, and then I'll pass it over to Sarah. First, this tool is we've used it in a formative and a developmental way. When I came to the role that I'm in, we had an opportunity to hire a number of new staff. And so we had a chance to get them familiar with many of the tenets that were in the tool. And so we don't just use it as a summative resource, but we've used it to help us to define the work and then to iterate our learning. So it's been really, really important. The second is that culture really matters around using these kinds of tools. If the sense is that we can't have open, honest, and transparent discussion about what we learn in them, then that really reduces their effectiveness. And so it's been really essential that as folks have kind of experienced the tool, that there have been opportunities for discussion and conversation. And this is the most important part, that they can't be in what's even perceived to be a punitive environment. That you really got to work on those power dynamics and make sure that the culture is one that doesn't kind of slap wrists for, articulating where there are strengths and where there are weaknesses, because it's in acknowledging those weaknesses that we find growth. And then the last piece is managing blind spots. And for us, what that meant is, if we took the tool, all of us inside, if we're not careful, we might be able to we get all sevens here, But it's important to ensure that, I think, we find some value in exposing other folks outside of the organization to the tool to give us their sense of how we're doing with respect to each of the categories. And that's been really helpful. Last thing I'll say, just to point to just two pieces that were really helpful for us. We found a lot of benefit out of, for folks that check out the tool, the understanding and skills section. And particularly want to point folks' attention to 5A, community knowledge, has been a really, really essential part at the Community Foundation, at Rochester Area Community Foundation, helping to define the idiosyncrasies of our community and articulate that to community members has been really helpful, particularly that seventh point there, current historical knowledge of the institution's leadership, economy, demographics, and so on and so forth. And we've been able to share, again, a lot of that idiosyncratic history about Rochester. One quick example of that, in 1950, Rochester's, we know about hopefully our listeners know about the Great Migration and the fact that lots of people came up from southern communities to northern communities in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on and so forth. In Rochester, that didn't really happen until the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so we have a relatively young communities of color in Rochester. And so some of the strategies that one might use, reaching out to for example, to churches or other benevolence organizations, we didn't have those kinds of organizations with the kind of robustness and strength that one might otherwise expect to see. And so it's been really helpful to have a tool like this to push us to do the homework, to do the work, to recognize that we needed that deeper community knowledge, those idiosyncratic insights to drive our work. We had to think through, how do we help to build and create some of that infrastructure? And we recently launched a new racial equity growth fund that's intended to do just that. to provide dollars for innovative gap-filling solutions that are emerging out of communities of color. And in many ways, some of that work is a direct legacy of our participation with this tool. So I'll stop there and just say it's been really a wonderful experience engaging the tool. I really encourage folks to use it because of the format. The instructions say to use it, every couple of years. For us, we actually use it a little bit more frequently than that, and we use it in sections. And so I'm excited to see how usage of the tool evolves as we move through time. And I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Simeon. Thanks so much. And one, just to jump in really quickly to kind of to linger on a point you made about how using the tool, you want to make sure that you avoid using it punitively. And I think that's an important point to lift up here because, a foundation who's filling out this assessment for the first time, it's not set up for them to basically race to the strong indicator at the conclusion of the exercise. It's just to understand or help internally the colleagues at the foundation to understand where there might be areas for improvement and what your priorities might be in those specific areas, and not necessarily an exercise just to say, that we're weak in specific areas and we just need to make sure that we get stronger just to get stronger. You need to have a clear perspective on exactly what you're hoping to achieve by doing so. So thank you so much for that. And so Sarah, I'm going to ask you the same question. What did you think when you tested the tool? If there were any items that resonated from it, any of the specific dimensions, and how did you imagine using it internally?
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks also for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. I'll share that I first kind of interacted with this type of thing with the community, the CFLeads framework. I was part of an Executive Leadership Institute, and we had all the building blocks, and we put all these dots all over them, red, green, and yellow, based on what we thought, and it was an incredibly useful exercise. And we all thought, we can use this internally, and we did. And what this tool is doing is turning it into a tool to use that with the scale. And so just kudos, because you said when you framed it, David, that you set out to really create a tool that's usable and to help identify areas of strength and areas for improvement. You nailed it. So very useful. So when I first, saw it, it was, oh, this is an even more useful tool to kind of put all of that work into practice. And what has been really helpful for us is that it gives us the way to frame the interactions both internally and externally. And what I mean by that is, as Deborah and David mentioned, community leadership is massive. It means so many things to different people. And so this gives us some common language when we are talking internally, when we're talking with our board, when we're talking with external stakeholders about what we really mean by that, and where we are and where we aspire to go. So that's what's really resonated with us most is that common language to have conversations and to ask good questions. So understanding, where we're strong and where we need to improve just as importantly, and add focus, and then what exactly to aspire to be and to dig in those areas. So that has kind of been our first impression, and our practical use of the tool is to use the language for interactions, so we're all on the same page. In terms of our engagement with the tool, what really struck me initially was the work around 2C and the commitment to DEI, and Simeon talked a lot about the being able to measure and rate and that kind of thing. And this is a particularly difficult area, as Deborah talked about too, to get your arms around. But this really stood out to us as, okay, the Community Foundation has been saying for years that equity is a priority, something we need to focus on. But it's, this gives us some common language to say, what does that mean? We want to be better. What does it mean to be better? Where do we need to focus our attention? And so this has been really helpful for us to say where we are and where we want to go. In the past couple of months, we set up a board task force that's turning into a standing committee, and been able to wrestle with all of these things to say, are we all on the same page about what we mean by having a commitment to DEI? And from there, where do we go? So that's been one of our really early engagements with the tool. Another one I'll add is around the business model questions, and that has become a key part of a current strategic plan that we're a part of, and again, that we're doing. And again, it's this notion of community leadership, so important and so massive, and that has given us mainly internally the right questions and framing to talk about how it can and should be part of the business model, not just kind of the things that we do, but because it's sometimes so hard to measure, how do we start building it into our measurement? So that's been really useful as well.
Terrific. Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, on the point about business model too, that takes me back to Deborah's earlier comment about how so many community foundations that responded to the survey we put out last year was, they were saying that they wanted to deepen their engagement and wanted to increase their investment in community leadership in its many different forms. And, as Deborah mentioned, that, leadership is not something you're doing on the side. It's not a special initiative of the Community Foundation. It is embedded deeply in the model as the foundation, embodies these different roles and becomes an active player in the foundation. So I'm glad that this section of the tool itself, was able to resonate with you as you were testing it. But I'm just curious, Sarah, I'll start with you. So you mentioned a couple of these items, so around the business model and around DEI. You don't have to answer for all of them, but if you want to just maybe pick one, just kind of curious to know where you thought the foundation ranked at the time, and say a little bit about why you thought so.
Sure.
And you can just tell me which item and I'll scroll to it.
Yeah, sorry, then I'll make you go back to the commitment to DEI.
Sure.
And on that one, to be very honest, there's three pieces inside of that 2C, as you can see on here, and they're really powerful pieces, right? They each encompasses a lot. And I think I would say pretty much across the board of these three, we are basic moving to moderate. With inclusion of underserved communities a little more towards the middle, but I think where we are, is still kind of on the journey, and particularly what you all were talking about before in terms of the role of power and being transparent about that. In our grant making in particular, we're really trying to get collect better data about what our grant making looks like, and be transparent about it, and put out that we know historically we haven't been where we want to be, and so we're on a journey to get there. So short answer, moving from basic up hopefully to the stronger sooner than later.
Terrific. Yeah, and thank you for that. And yeah, I think you framed it perfectly when you call it a journey, right? It's not like you flip a switch and all of a sudden you go from 3 to 5 or 5 to 7. It isn't. It takes time. It takes buy-in. It takes partnership. It takes collaboration, and you have to apply the long view to this work as well. So with that, Simeon, I'll ask you the same question. If there was a particular item in the assessment that you wanted to mention as far as where you thought the foundation rated itself or could rate itself, and say a little bit about why.
Sure. So I'll point back to the 5A, and then also point to one other on 5A with community context and history. It's interesting when we initially took the assessment. I think we would have ranked probably a 3-4 kind of basic, moderate. We had certainly kind of a sense of the community. We benefited from a CEO who had a service time that lent itself to really having deep knowledge about Rochester. But one of the things that's been fascinating is that our community, by some accounts, has been identified as a community that still deals with some issues around segregation, both racial and economic. And so it's been really interesting to expand our community knowledge beyond just kind of the, kind of more traditional arena, and really try to get deeper knowledge about not only communities of color, but about hard to reach communities, about our displaced peoples communities, about some of our First People communities here in Rochester. We're here on Habnasi land. And so we've been able to really kind of extend that deeply. I think the other thing that was interesting is as we look at each of these characteristics. In some cases, we might find individuals in our organizations that espouse some of these characteristics. But what's the extent to which the organization itself has embraced it and that it's kind of broadly shared? And so to that end, it was wonderful to be able to share our presentation about Rochester's history, some of the information that I mentioned earlier, to our entire staff, so that everybody would have the language and would have the facility to be able to call on some of those facts as they were doing their work. And that wasn't just limited to our community programs department, but that was good information for everybody to know. And so that's been really, really helpful. And that's in many ways a testament to our CEO for kind of clearing the space for us to have that kind of conversation in staff meetings and in other venues, which has been really helpful. The other place I'd point to, and I think this might be an interesting tension for community foundations, it certainly is one for us, is on the communication strategy question. That would be 5C. And that's an interesting one because we have a couple of tropes, and I'm sure many of the viewers have these in their communities, that the community foundation is the best kept secret, that the community foundation has kind of labored hard but done so in some silence. And I think one of the things that was interesting for us to consider is how to do this in a way that frankly isn't kind of backslapping and navel gazing, but really is effective in leveraging additional resources and being able to bring more folks to the table. And so being able to kind of move from not having a formal communication strategy, we're kind of in this process now, kind of moving 3, 4, we're hopefully headed toward 5 and kind of starting to build out a real strategy. We'll be doing some public awareness work soon that I think is going to lend itself. And this coronavirus pandemic has also given us a chance to experiment with new tools. We hadn't really done webinars. We've done a few here and there, but we've done a lot more in the last 8 months than we had certainly before that. And so just finding other resources. Last thing I'd say, David, is that just when you think about the tool on the macro level, a lot of us community foundations are having conversations about interdepartmental work, how we work with community programs and our finance team and our communications folks and our philanthropic engagement folks. And this tool has been really helpful to guide our conversations. We have originally applied this internally. I'm excited about looking at kind of a foundation-wide application. But then in the meantime, it's also given our team better vectors through which we can engage our kind of partner departments across the organization in a more kind of structured way.
Terrific, thanks, Simeon, and thank you, Sarah, as well, for your thoughts and insights on the different dimensions here of the assessment tool. And one thing that I want to mention here, and I realize that this hour is flying by, so I want to make sure that we answer some audience questions before we go in 10 minutes or so. I just want to reiterate that folks can share their assessment results, with us. Again, that's candid.org/howwelead, because we'll be able to say a lot more about how community foundations assess themselves in these different dimensions. We did that public pilot that I mentioned earlier that had about 35 or so responses from folks. And, to be perfectly honest, when we opened that up, that's a self-selecting sample. And I thought, these are going to be folks that are already really interested in or deeply engaged in leadership. So we want to make sure that these results aren't skewed up toward the strong level, which might say something about how the questions are formulated, but that wasn't the case. Still, maybe everybody's just really humble, but that self-selecting sample, in many areas, there definitely seem to be some areas for improvement that basically every tester had identified when filling out the assessment. And so hopefully there's something in here for everyone when they see it for the first time. And again, to share your results with us online, and we're going to say a lot more about where the field sits and segment the field in different ways, and hopefully share some case studies as well. I want to thank you again, Simeon and Sarah, for your insights today, and I want to invite Deborah actually to join us once more, and we're going to take some audience questions in the next few minutes. So we got some really interesting ones. So I'm going to start with one that we received from Eric, who's watching us today. If he wants to know if there's any insight into the motivation for the push by community foundations for racial equity. Is that internally driven? Is it funder driven, constituent driven? If anyone wants to speak a little bit to that particular question, I will just open it up to anyone who wants to jump in with that.
Yes, I can. Deborah, why don't you lead us
Oh,
off?
go ahead. I'll join in after you, Simeon.
Fair enough. I would just point out that our story is kind of a little bit of a unique one because Rochester Area Community Foundation, there's been kind of an explicit engagement around equity as a primary goal area for us for almost the last decade. And so, and that really kind of body of work was initiated by bringing the exhibit Race, Are We So Different to Rochester, which at the time was our largest single grant that we had done to bring the exhibit, and it initiated a flurry of activity with a number of partners to start the conversation. I think what's exciting now is that the conversation is really kind of continuing to evolve into action, and particularly the action that's informed by, again, this kind of historical reference point, so that we're responding to the unique concerns in our community. And so I would definitely urge folks to really, take that time to get to know the specifics. There's some national tropes that I think we're all familiar with as it relates to racial equity, but digging in on the specifics of your community is a gold mine of insights to start to really make actual headway on racial equity.
I would just add one, and I'm interested about, I know Deborah has a good bird's eye view of all of this as well. I think, for the DCF, we have been, similarly, equity has been kind of a priority focus area for several years, with still definition need about what that means. And especially over the last 8 months, it's really, to a year, it's becoming, something that is a foundation of all that we do. So rather than a focus area, something across the board. And I would say a big part of that transition has been the last 8 months, and the response, the community need that we've seen in response to COVID, and how we see the issues of inequity through that, through the pandemic, really rising up and just, exacerbating all the inequities, and just a realization that it's got to be in something that we do across the board, how we approach things, how we, support the community. So I would say, yeah, that the last 8 months, it's really dialed up because we've seen it in action.
Yeah, and I would echo all of that. I would say, in the past few years, what I think I've seen is that this is about impact. And if we really want to move the needle on some outcomes, some community outcomes, we've got to address racial equity. And I think more and more community foundations are recognizing that. I think some of you heard Helene Gale say on our webinar that, without doing this work, you're not going to be relevant going forward as our demographics change and so much. So, but I think there've been some real leaders, I think, in the field. I also think we can thank some of the national funders who have been supporting, for example, philanthropy serving organizations to really help philanthropy itself to do this work more. So Borealis Funders Group. So I just think, and I think now community is speaking loudly. And if we are, as community foundations, if we are listening, this is something that community is demanding, and no surprise.
Terrific. Thank you all so much. And in the interest of time, I'm going to see if we can maybe squeeze in 2 more questions here. And I'll start with this one. And Simeon, I think you alluded to this a little bit during your remarks earlier, but have you seen consensus on where the foundation is in internal responses to the tool itself, or negotiating different views of how the foundation might position itself on different items on the rating scale? So Sarah, I'll actually start with you on this question, and then Simeon, give you an opportunity to share your thoughts as well.
It's really interesting. I do think, and it varies from section to section, but overall, when we have the opportunity to, like Simeon mentioned, to then have these internal dialogues after the use of the tool, that really has brought us into more of an aligned view of where we are, because because we're starting at the same starting point, and then we have those opportunities to say, well, this is how I interpret it, or this is what I bring. So I think through those conversations, we have gotten to more alignment where there were places that we internally may have felt like we were a little bit different. I think too, the tension that he described in the communication strategy is very real. And so in some of these, when folks see their particular body of work and it can feel like, well, I want to be farther along than that. But again, it gives us the opportunity to have no judgment internal conversations and kind of get to a place of where we really are and where we need to go.
Great. Simeon, anything to add?
Yeah, and I would just add to that. So, again, this point about not being punitive, it isn't enough just to say you're not going to get in trouble if you answer this honestly. You actually have to evidence that the culture really is situated that people can be, very transparent and very honest. And so there's some, kind of pre-work to do in terms of managing some of those dynamics. I do want to just say very quickly a note about the external piece of sharing this, that as you're thinking about partners, also think about the community itself. And I want you to think especially about the folks in the community that are the most disenfranchised, the most disaffected, because folks have some real interesting insights about our organizations, about how they function, about how relevant they are. Just the conversation itself can be very helpful in opening some doors and creating some conduits for conversation. And you'll find a lot of great insights in some very what we might think of as unlikely places.
Thank you both. Yeah, and we wrote about there's a little section on this in the first section of the assessment tool in the guidance section. You'll see that in the opening pages of the tool itself. We talk a little bit about carving out time to work with to have a conversation with your team members about areas where you're very, very far apart, because there might be more to unpack there in terms of not just perception, but about the actual experiences of the different members of the team as well, and how folks might be seeing the foundation's engagement in a particular dimension as very, very different from another team member who's working at the same foundation, and you want to go ahead and try and unpack that as best you can. And I know we're so close to being out of time. I did want to ask one more question, so I'll ask it and then maybe just give a few seconds to respond. So Simeon, I'll ask you first in maybe 30 seconds or so. Do you see any opportunities for the communities that community foundations are serving to have a voice in how the foundation actually completes the assessment? Do you think there are any items that you can face outward to your communities? Because I'm curious to know that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about it. In 30 seconds, I'll say that many of my models in community work tend to be data-driven and then sometimes community-informed. And we're doing some things to try to flip that model to be community-driven and data-informed. And a lot of that really is, how you establish the discourse. It would take me a little bit longer than 30 seconds to kind of go through each of the sections that are really relevant. Frankly, there are a lot of places here that are, like I said, places for rich conversation. Everything from communications to research to how you share data with the community, whether that data is accessible and so on and so forth. So a lot of great areas to engage the community, get some honest feedback.
Well, I unfortunately need to say that we're out of time. I wish we can go on for much longer, but unfortunately we do have to go. But for now, I do want to say thank you to Deborah, Sarah, and Simeon for sharing their expertise and insights with us today. And Elizabeth, thank you for keeping everything running smoothly for us here. Thank you also to everyone on the line for taking time out of your day on a Friday to join our conversation. And one other thing I do want to mention right before we go is that a number of you have been reaching out asking about the latest Columbus survey results, which I mentioned much earlier, the annual CF Insights Columbus survey. Those results are going to be released very, very soon. I'm not going to say specifically when, but I'm confident in saying it's going to be a matter of days as opposed to weeks. So very, very soon. So to that end, on behalf of our team here at Candid and all of our speakers, thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a great weekend.